God's people, Israel, have descended into absolute chaos. And we see that their world has become a world in which women are objectified, where life is cheap, and a world with no rules, all because they have rejected God as their king. We've made it to the final section in the book of Judges, and what we'll see here is that things really have descended into absolute chaos. If you haven't already done so, I encourage you just to take some time to read the whole of Judges 19 to 21 and spend some time praying and asking God to help you to understand why this difficult, tragic section is in God's word. And as I always do in these videos, I will seek to show you just some of what I've seen in the text that will help us to unpack why this is here. The sermon I preached on this section I simply called Israel Had No King. Now, we saw that chorus in the previous section, and what we've seen is that Judges has a double outro, where you've got chapters 17 and 18, where you see Israel with no king doing what's right in their own eyes when it comes to their religious life. And in these chapters, we see in those days Israel had no king. Everyone's doing what is right in their own eyes, and we see the moral corruption of their evil hearts and what this led to. And you see this particularly just in how the section is bracketed with this statement, in those days Israel had no king. And so straight away that shows you that everything we're going to see here is as a result of Israel rejecting God as king. Because even though it says Israel had no king, we know that they were a nation under God. God was their king, but they had rejected God as king. And we'll see that picked up in the book of Samuel, where they ask for a human king, and God says to Samuel, no, they've rejected me as king. And in this world with no king, everyone is doing what's right in their own eyes. Now, the first way just to see a little bit more of the structure in this section is to look at the different characters that we see throughout this section. And the first key character that we meet in this section is a Levite. We're told a number of things about this Levite. The Levites were the tribe who were meant to lead God's people to worship God rightly. But what we see about this Levite is that he was an incredibly wicked man. Just a few details. Firstly, he's from the hill country of Ephraim. Again, as in the previous section, it's playing a key role. And again, what we'll see in the hill country of Ephraim, that is where God's house was. In the previous section, we saw that God's house was in Shiloh, where in this section, we will see that God's house was in Bethel. It says in those days, the Ark of the Covenant was there in Bethel, but Bethel is also in the hill country of Ephraim. Now, so again, he had every opportunity to worship God rightly, in God's way, in God's place. But we see that he took a concubine. So she's like a second-class wife used mostly for sexual satisfaction, which gives you a little bit of a feel for the character of this guy. We see the concubine's unfaithful to him. So in the first part, these are the two key characters, this Levite and his concubine. But throughout the section, we see both this man and other men in this section objectifying women. They're treating women merely as objects to be used. This first interaction with the Levite and his father-in-law, just the father-in-law keeps him there for a few extra days, but then eventually he says, no, we're out of here, we're going to leave. And they look for somewhere to spend the night. And we're told they went to Jebus, or they were close to Jebus, which eventually becomes Jerusalem. But at this stage, it is a pagan city still. The Jebusites are living there. And so they say, no, well, they're not going to stay there. They carry on to the next town. He said, let's see if we'll go to Gibeah or Ramah. The tragedy is, if they had stayed in Jebus, things may have ended up much better for the Levite's concubine than what we see unfolding in Gibeah. The story around this Levite becomes incredibly disturbing here around chapter 19, verse 22, where this Levite and his concubine are enjoying themselves, having dinner at this old man's house who is staying in Gibeah, but he's from their hometown. the area where they come from, the hill country of Ephraim. But while they're enjoying this dinner, we're told that some wicked men came and pounded on the door, and they shouted to the old man, "Bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him." Now, that is a very similar scene to what we see playing out in Genesis chapter 19 with Sodom. So these men, these Israelite men, God's people, are more like Sodomites than Israelites at this stage because they have rejected God as their king. Now, the old man says, no, he won't do that. But what we see is that the owner of the house offers his virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine. That is unthinkably wicked. He's offering them as objects merely to be used. Now, the crowd don't want to hear that. They won't listen to him. But then the Levite takes his concubine and he kicks her out the door. And I think in one of the most tragic sections in the Bible, we're told that they raped her and abused her throughout the night. And at dawn, they let her go. It is a truly horrific scene as this evil Levite treats his concubine as an object to be used to protect himself, and he kicks her out the door. And the wicked men of the city of Gibeah use her throughout the night as an object to feed their depraved cravings. But again, we see more of the character of this man. When he gets up in the morning, he opens the door and he steps out to continue on his way. It's as if nothing's happened. And we're told there lay his concubine, fallen in the doorway of the house with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, "Get up, let's go." Again, there doesn't seem to be any heart in his care for this woman. But then he picks her up, puts her on his donkey and sets out for home and does something absolutely despicable. He takes a knife. On reaching home, he takes a knife and cuts her up into 12 pieces and sends them to the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, we'll see the Israelites, they will question him on that. And the last things that we see about this Levite is he gives them an account of what happened. But in the account, he twists all the details. He says here, during the night, the men or the leaders of Gibeah came. But we see, no, it was the wicked men. It wasn't all the men of Gibeah. But he escalates the story. He says, they came after me and surrounded the house intending to kill me. Now, we're told they said they wanted to have sex with him, which is absolutely terrible, but it's not quite what he says. He says they actually wanted to kill him. And then he just goes on to say they raped my concubine and she died. He doesn't give the details of when this Levite man, kicked his concubine out of the door. And then he just says, I took my concubine and cut her to pieces. He doesn't say why he did that. He just kind of recounts it as if it was almost a normal thing to do. But it just shows that in this world, where they have rejected God as king, where everyone is doing what's right in their own eyes, women are being objectified, treating as objects to be used for his own advantage. And so in this first section, we see those key characters. You've got the Levite, you've got his concubine, you've got these wicked men from the city of Gibeah. And then from chapter 20, the characters change. You've still got at the beginning of chapter 20 a little bit about the Levite and his concubine as he retells the story. But then the characters change and you see Israel becomes the key character going up in war against Israel. And what we see in chapter 20 is that not only are women objectified, because we'll see that again, but now this is a world where life is very cheap. Tragically, where we see everyone who saw it, there's a lot of this everyone language, and all the Israelites, they came as one man. So there's this one man type language. This is the most united that we've seen Israel in the book of Judges. But the tragedy is they are as one man against the city of Gibeah. Now, the wicked men of the city of Gibeah did need to be punished. But what we see in this whole story is that as they take justice into their own hands, they go to extreme and terrible lengths, showing how cheaply they viewed life. Now, in this section, we are told a few times they assembled before the Lord, they inquired of God. We see this strange reply. The Lord replied, Judah shall go first. Now that is the same wording that we heard in chapter 1 verse 2, where they were meant to be going up against their enemies. But in chapter 1 verse 2, where it said, Judah will go first and I will give them into your hands, that next part of the statement isn't there. The Lord doesn't promise victory. And actually, throughout this section, they aren't asking the Lord what they should do. By the time they go, they just say, who should go first against the Benjamites? They didn't ask God whether they should go against the Benjamites. They've made up their minds. And the Lord says, okay, go, go, go. But in all of these replies, they are actually the Lord answering in judgment against his people for rejecting him as king. We see the men of Gibeah acting in judgment against the men of Israel, as in the first two battles, they actually come out on top against the men of Israel. But then finally, at the end of the battle, from this point onwards, we see that the men of Israel make a plan and they do go and defeat the city of Gibeah. And we're told here in verse 35 that the Lord defeated Benjamin. So the Lord used the Israelites against the Israelites to judge the wicked Gibeonites for their wickedness against that concubine. The problem is the story should have ended here, but chapter 20 continues. We see from this point onwards, the Israelites continue to fight now not only against Gibeah. When we're given the summary at the end of chapter 20 from verse 46, we see that life has become very cheap, because not only do they destroy the whole city of Gibeah, they go on, and it says here, the men of Israel went back to Benjamin and put all the towns, not only the town of Gibeah, all the towns to the sword. They killed everyone. Men, women, children, animals, everything. They put all the towns to death and set them on fire. This is showing just how cheap life had become. They didn't have to do what they did here, but they took things into their own hands, did what was right in their own eyes, and completely annihilated all the Benjamites. By the end of chapter 20, there are only 600 Benjamite men left, hiding in the desert at the rock of Rimmon, which leads us into chapter 21, where the characters change again. We see that Israel are still a key character here, but it's now just Israel and Benjamin. And again, the Lord is mentioned a few times in this section, but again, they don't ask the Lord what to do. They're doing things their own way. They've taken a stupid oath that they didn't need to take. It's a little bit like Jephthah early on in the book, making a vow that he didn't need to vow. Well, they had made this oath that they wouldn't give their daughters in marriage to Benjamites. Now, they could have then gone to the Lord and asked him what to do, because what we see in chapter 20, verse 27, is that in those days, the Ark of the Covenant of God was there. This is the place where God said his presence would be with his people and he would give them his good law to know, so they could know how to live his way in his world for his glory. They had every opportunity to ask God, but in a world with no king, people make their own rules. And that's what we see in chapter 21. They made this stupid oath, and then they made their own rules to try and figure out how to fix the problem they had made. And so they then find out about these people of the city of Jabesh Gilead, who hadn't come to the assembly. And again, they take things into their own hand and they say, we must put to the sword all those living there, including women and children. And then we'll just grab the virgins. They decide to treat these women as objects, just like the Levite had done. And they hand them over to the Benjamites. It's absolutely horrific what they're doing, because in a world without God as king, women are objectified. Life is cheap. They destroy the people and they make their own rules. They're just coming up with their own ways of dealing with the issue they created. But we're told that there were not enough for the 600 Benjamite men. They still needed 200. So again, they come up with another stupid plan. And they say, well, when the girls of Shiloh come out to dance, let's let the Benjamites just go grab one and take her home as a wife. It's said almost just matter-of-factly. When the girls of Shiloh come out to join the dancing, then rush from the vineyards, and each of you seize a wife from the girls of Shiloh and go to the land of Benjamin. Again, it's horrific what they are suggesting here, but they're doing what's right in their own eyes, because in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. So by that time we get to the end of the book of Judges, it really is this horrific scene that's played out, and these chapters really should leave us disturbed as we see how women are objectified, how life is cheap in this world with no rules, because they're living without God as king. They're making up their own rules and doing what's right in their own eyes. But very interestingly, right at the end of this book, we are told that they returned to their inheritance. And if you go and read Genesis 17, you'll see that God had promised to give them the land of Canaan. And that promise that had been made 1,000 years earlier, where God had promised to give them the land, and then God said, I will be your God. Part of that promise is shown to be fulfilled here. They're in the land of inheritance, which means that God's promises are not completely off track. God's people have messed up a whole lot, but God is still at work in the details of this story because they're in the land of their inheritance. And so in these days, when Israel had no king, the book of Judges ends in a very bleak place with everybody doing what's right in their own eyes. But God's promises are just hinted at being on track, in that an inheritance that was promised is still spoken of. But it was the land of God's inheritance with God as their king. But in these days, Israel had no king. But wonderfully, in the big Bible story, we see that Judges is not the end of the story. This is followed by the book of Ruth. In the days when the judges ruled, we see this beautiful story of love and redemption. And then the book of Ruth is followed by the book of Samuel, where God answers his people by giving them a human king. First, the king Saul, who wasn't a great human king, but then comes the king David, who the book of Ruth set up. From the line of Ruth and Boaz, we get to King David. And to David, God promised that an everlasting king would come. There wouldn't be a day in which God's people wouldn't have a king, because King Jesus would be the everlasting king who would save people who do what's right in their own eyes. He would give them hearts that actually don't just do what they like, but hearts that know him and love him and follow him. And so, even though the end of Judges is so bleak, it should grow our longing for this king who really has the power to save us from us. The king who really has the power to change our hearts. And I think as you work through this and teach it to others, it's worth just highlighting that we still live in a world like chapter 19, where women are objectified, like chapter 20, where life is cheap, like chapter 21, where everyone's making up their own rules. But unlike the days of the judges, we know that there is a king on the throne. His name is Jesus. And we want to be thinking very carefully about how the difference that Jesus has made in transforming our hearts should shape the way we live. We shouldn't be like these people in the days of the judges, objectifying women or treating life as cheap or just making up our own rules. But rather, we should be seeking to live God's way in God's world for God's glory. Well, God bless as you dig in further.